distinct pleasure and honor of introducing one of my esteemed colleagues, James Young, from UMass. He's a native Californian, so I can at the same time welcome him back. He received his BA and his PhD from UC Santa Cruz with a master's degree from Berkeley in between. He went on to teach religious studies at Bryn Mawr and then at NYU. And he's now at UMass Amherst. He's had a number of very distinguished guest professorships at the University of Washington in Seattle, and most recently last year at Harvard University and at Princeton as well. His articles have been published in literally dozens of the top scholarly journals and collections in various disciplines, ranging from literature, history, cultural studies, Holocaust studies, right on down to many articles in journals of the highbrow press, our well-known New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, and Germany, the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung. Instead of naming various individual articles, I'd like to structure my introduction according to his three major publications. His work is, he's a professor, as Leonard Walk has said, of English and Judaic studies, and his work is really truly interdisciplinary. In fact, it's probably more multidisciplinary than anyone else I know. He began, I believe, by studying the literary aspects of Holocaust survivor narratives and analyzing their structure. That work was not only work in literary analysis, but included the psychological and sociological dimensions as well. He's worked with videotape testimonies, so including many aspects that have to do with that new medium. His first major book, which appeared first in 1988, it was reprinted 2 years later. It has been translated into German and Swedish as well. It's a widely read standard work in the literary study of Holocaust memoirs, ranking right up with works by some of the doyens of literary Holocaust studies, such as Lawrence Langer. It's entitled Writing and Rewriting the Holocaust, Narrative and the Consequences of Interpretation. It's in a widely ranging comparative work. He did research in many countries and many archives, and while conducting that research, he noticed in the various countries the international context, the actual physical context of the repositories of those works were very different. And his attention to the cultural context in which these survivor narratives were created and were disseminated and were received by their audiences led him, in the final chapter of that book, which became the title of his next book, to analyze the memorials of the Holocaust. That book was entitled The Texture of Memory, Holocaust Memorials and Meaning. It was published by Yale University Press in 1993, and it has already appeared in German, and as I hear, will soon be coming out in Japanese translation as well. It examines 5 countries and their memorialization practices: Germany and Austria, Poland, Israel, and the United States. It adds art interpretation to his impressive list of disciplines, as does the book that he'll be signing after today's talk, At Memory's Edge, After Images of the Holocaust in Contemporary Art and Architecture. The Texture of Memory, his second book, has also become a standard work, both in the theory of memorials and in its internationally comparative dimension in the history of the reception of the Holocaust in each of those countries. Emerging from that book as a kind of way of making public some of the results he had, he curated an exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York. It was entitled The Art of Memory, Holocaust Memorials in History. It was accompanied by an English and German catalog. The exhibition, after being shown in New York, went on to venues in Berlin and Munich. And emerging from this work, because of his very distinguished international reputation as really the preeminent scholar of the Holocaust and its memorialization, he was appointed to the German commission that was charged with finding a design for a national Holocaust memorial in 1997. And I don't want to preempt any of this talk. It's fascinating material, but I'd like to emphasize how unique this appointment was. He was not only the only foreigner who was invited to participate in a very intimate process of finding an appropriate, the Germans finding an appropriate relationship to this horrible blemish on the German national past. If you can imagine inviting someone from Vietnam to come and help us design the national memorial to our veterans in the Vietnam War. So he was invited both as a foreigner and as a Jew to participate in the selection of that memorial. He has written about and spoken about his unique role in that process in a very interesting self-reflection of just what it meant to be a foreigner advising Germans on how to commemorate Jews. Without further ado, I'd like to invite James to come up and tell us about Germany's Holocaust Memorial, which was, by the way, a cornerstone was just laying the end of January of this year.
Thanks. Thanks, Alan. Well, thank you very much for having me. It is a pleasure, in fact, to come home again. I was remarking, though, that one of the reasons I had to leave California was that it was easy to read on the beach, but impossible to write on the beach. So I had to go back east, where I moved in the late 70s to do my real dissertation research and writing, and then stayed on the East Coast in New York and eventually now in Massachusetts. As Harold had mentioned, my early work on Holocaust literature expanded to include the spaces in which I was studying and writing about and thinking about Holocaust memoirs and diaries, fiction and historiography, to include the spaces in which I was sitting. And Harold knows this kind of situation well, because I'm sure in his work at Dachau, for example, he understood that what he was reading and when he was reading it depended very much on the time and place in which he did his work, and how this place evolved over time. And in fact, as I know, his work will really be kind of a history of Dachau as it has evolved and changed from 1933 to 2001, which is, I think, a wonderful way to go about it. My aim has always been to rehistoricize these otherwise amnesiac sites. By themselves, they remember nothing. They depend on us for whatever memory we bring to them. We animate them with our visits. And I've found, in fact, that most Holocaust memorials remain, curiously silent until we begin to restore who brought them into being, who made them, under what conditions, who paid for them, who designed, the figures in these memorial sites, what was the aesthetic temper of the time, what were the politics driving the creation of these memorials. And I found that, in fact, every memorial, not just Holocaust memorials, but memorials to public events anywhere, are always created in kind of an intersection of aesthetic temper, political needs, economic realities of the moment. The site itself will help shape, whatever ends up getting put there. And clearly the meanings created in any given time will necessarily evolve over time. As Harold will be pointing out in the study of Dachau, and as I've tried to make the point in all my work on Holocaust memorials, to tell their evolving histories over time. What is made in 1948, say in Warsaw, is understood very differently now and will be understood very differently in another 50 years. Whatever we have now in Washington, for example, will mean something completely different from what it means now in this time and place. And we need, in fact, to open up room in all these spaces for these meanings to evolve over time. This is how memorials continue to live in our minds. It's the moment, in fact, that they become irrelevant, that they become invisible as well, and eventually are torn down. Now, here I'm approaching a problem in Germany that nobody else has really addressed before, that is, no other country has addressed before. How does a nation like Germany remember a massive crime perpetrated in its name? How does a nation like Germany reunite itself on the bedrock memory of its crimes? Countries don't build themselves or their memorial cultures around their remembered crimes. Countries build themselves around their remembered martyrdom or around their remembered triumphs, but never around crimes they perpetrate, where, for example, are the stones on the mall, the Washington Mall right now, commemorating slavery. You know, that there were slave auctions held on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. for about 50 years. There's not a mention of this. Nations don't build themselves on the memory of crimes they perpetrate. You know, where are the memorials now in Washington to the genocide of Native Americans? They also don't exist. When nations remember, they tend to remember their own victimization or their triumphs, that is, their own victimization, so they remember themselves as martyrs and find perhaps the birth of the nation a kind of redemption of their own martyrdom, if you will, or they remember their triumphs as a way to affirm perhaps their divine election, you know, that they deserve to exist, you know, by having triumphed over evil. And not just our memorial culture, but any nation's memorial culture is usually built on these premises. In Germany's case, however, they've been asked, and they've asked themselves, to create not just a national Holocaust memorial, but in some ways to create a national identity based on the Holocaust. And I will actually raise this question and ask, you know, what it means for any nation actually to create a national identity based on its own crimes. So here I'd like to blend kind of a formal presentation and informal. I do want to relate some of the explicit language I used at the time once I was appointed to try to convey a little bit of the sense of exactly what Germans heard at the time. I mean, language here is very important, as you'll see, and how we think about these things all together. Once not so long ago, Germany had what it called its Jewish problem. Then it had a paralyzing Holocaust memorial problem, a double-edged conundrum. How would a nation of former perpetrators mourn its victims? And how would a divided nation reunite itself on the bedrock memory of its crimes? In June 1999, after 10 years of tortured debate, the German Bundestag voted to build its national memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe on a prime 5-acre piece of real estate located between the Brandenburger Tor and the Potsdamer Platz, a stone's throw from Hitler's bunker. In their vote, the Bundestag also accepted the design, a waving field of pillars, by American architect Peter Eisenman, which had been recommended by a 5-member Findungskommission, for which I eventually served as spokesman or Sprecher. Proposed originally by a citizens group headed by television talk show personality and journalist Leah Roche and World War II historian Eberhard Jäckel, the memorial soon took on a fraught and highly politicized life of its own. Although I had initially opposed a single central Holocaust memorial in Germany for the ways I feared it might be used to compensate such irredeemable loss, or even as a way to put the past behind a newly reunified Germany, over time I began to grow skeptical of my own skepticism. Eventually I was invited to join a 5-member Findungskommission charged with choosing an appropriate design for Germany's national memorial to Europe's murdered Jews, the only foreigner and Jew on the panel, as Harald mentioned. Now, in this talk, I'd like to tell the story of both Germany's national memorial to the Holocaust and my own role in it, my evolution from a highly skeptical critic on the outside of the process to one of the arbiters on the inside. And I find that as the line between my role as critic and arbiter began to collapse, the issues at the heart of Germany's memorial conundrum came into ever sharper, more painful relief. And I don't want to include my role here as a kind of a self-aggrandizement, but the reasons they would end up turning to somebody like me, I think, are quite instructive. I've described as kind of a Germany's contemporary Jewish aphasia. They more or less lobotomize themselves of kind of Jewish culture, Jewish sensibility. And one of the results of this was a terrible mistake in their first competition. They chose a bad design, but they had a blindness. They didn't understand how bad it was when they chose it. Had they had any kind of a Jewish sensibility in the country just to shake them and just to hold up a mirror and just let them know how bad this was, they might not have come to this state. But part of this fraught debate was that they were these were Germans trying to remember a crime against Jews, and part of the crime was that it had consumed a Jewish sensibility that might have reflected back to them what they needed to do. So this was all part of their problem. Now, I think that the seeds of Germany's National Holocaust Memorial were probably sown during President Ronald Reagan's disastrous Riesling visit at Chancellor Helmut Kohl's invitation at the military cemetery in Bitburg, where the tombstones of Waffen-SS soldiers lay side by side those of Wehrmacht conscripts. Like other nations, Kohl believed Germany should also have ready-made memorial sites where foreign dignitaries could pay their respects to their host war dead and fallen heroes. This was a time-honored tradition, and Kohl seemed to believe a crucial step toward Germany's own normalization, its return to a respected place among the nations. The problem, of course, was that unlike other nations, a memorial honoring both Germany's war dead and its heroes would in essence be a self-contradicting memorial. Those now considered its heroes had been regarded as treacherous enemies of the state during the war, while its fallen soldiers had been killed in Hitler's campaign to conquer Europe and murder its Jews. As the Green Party had put it then, state guests from abroad who want to honor the dead by laying a wreath will understand that in the Federal Republic of Germany, the erection of a national monument will run aground because of the danger of equating the deaths of perpetrators and victims of National Socialist crimes against humanity. Now, stung by the near universal opprobrium generated by this ill-fated attempt to follow the protocol of other nations, Kohl decided to take matters into his own hands and basically proposed a national memorial of sorts, and this directly after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, when he decided to make the Neue Wache, kind of this Prussian guardhouse designed by Schinkel, a national memorial site whereby all the victims of tyranny and war and violence could be remembered. So you have the memory of bombing victims next to the memory of Wehrmacht soldiers killed on the front, next to the memory of Jews, next to the memory of gypsies, next to the memory of Soviet POWs. Everybody remembered here together, which of course means that nobody was remembered. Everybody was supposed to be remembered in one place. And they were all to be remembered in the kind of the beautiful sculpture by Käthe Kollwitz, a kind of a pietà, a mother holding a dead son, but it's very much a Christian icon, if you will, a mother holding a dead son. It seemed to be redemptive in some ways, and it didn't occur to Kohl at the time that there might be something unseemly about remembering, say, Jewish victims in a very Christian kind of image. One of the results is that this Neue Wache is now actually rarely visited by Germans. It's visited as a curiosity by tourists, but nobody knows quite what to make of it. And it was only as an afterthought, in fact, that specific memories of Jews and gypsies and others were put on the portico so that each of these groups would be remembered. About the same time, Leo Roche and Eberhard Jekyll were campaigning for a national Holocaust memorial, which they had thought might be placed on, say, Hitler's bunker. They had Leo Roche, as you'll see, actually always had very strange tastes and played a very kind of both inspirational role, but a very problematic role throughout, the whole debate. Eventually, they also wanted to put this then on the Gestapo Gelände, which had the former Gestapo kind of headquarters there in Berlin. And then eventually the government gave them this huge piece of land between the Brandenburger Tor and Potsdamer Platz, the so-called ministerial gardens, right on the edge of the Tiergarten, right across the street from the statue to Goethe. And it's actually a very prime piece of real estate. But again, there's no perfect place for such a memorial. And there will always be debates about where it should be. But this is a 20,000 square meter site, almost 5 acres. And many people fear that just the size of the site alone would dictate a certain kind of bombastic monumentality that they wanted to, resist. And one of the things that I also, was resisting from the very beginning, I had written at length about these counter-monuments, a German generation's impulse to challenge conventional monumentality which they felt was in fact essentially authoritarian or even fascist. Contemporary German artists are quite suspicious of the monument as a form, basically a big rock telling people what to think, that regards itself as unchanging and permanent, and so there's no such thing. If it's made by human beings, it is changing, it is not permanent, meanings change, and this is basically an authoritarian kind of sculpture or architecture which we want to avoid. As a result, they've come up with these brilliant and problematic conceptual responses like disappearing monuments, invisible monuments, monuments built under the ground. Daniel Liebeskind's Jewish Museum in Berlin built around the notion of voids, rather than material presence. And with all this going on, in fact, they called a gigantic memorial competition in 1994, a memorial for what they called Germany's National Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. And some 528 submissions came in from around the world from all kinds of artists. They seeded it, with about 50 very famous artists and architects. And the submissions ran the complete gamut of both taste and sensibility and aesthetic temper. Some of my favorites could never have been chosen. One of my favorites was Horst Hoheisler's proposal to blow up the Brandenburger Tor, for example. He says, blow up the Brandenburger Tor, grind the stone into dust, and cover the whole area with granite plates. How better to remember a destroyed people than by destroying the national monument? And he had a point here, but he's also he's the sculptor who also designed a negative form monument in Kassel, and he's meant to be pedagogical. And of course, one of his points was that such a memorial could never be accepted, by the government. In fact, no memorial should ever be accepted by the government, and that at the time, in fact, I concurred. I suggested, in fact, in kind of a quote that was picked up and repeated almost every time I picked up a German paper, rather than finishing this competition, there should be, in fact, no final solution to Germany's memorial problem. Better 1,000 years of Holocaust competition, memorial competitions, than a final solution here. The resonances were clear to everybody there, and this was really Horst Hoheisler's point in his design. Among others was Dani Caravan's proposed field of yellow flowers in the shape of a star. Renate Stee and Friedrich Schnock proposed a bus stop instead of what they called the non-monument. They would have a series of 600 double-decker red buses parked in this great site, each one every day scheduled to go to a particular site of destruction, to Auschwitz, to Treblinka, to Dachau, to Buchenwald, to destroyed synagogues within Berlin, and there would be the destination on every single bus. So in effect, you would have 600 traveling monuments, going throughout, Europe every single day. And if you would go and check the schedule and get on the bus anytime you wanted and go out to one of these sites and then read about where you're going and kind of, learn. It was kind of a centrifugal monument, if you will, throwing everybody out of Berlin. There were also, I think, many much less interesting designs, including a gigantic empty vat, 130 feet tall, which was to be large enough to contain all the blood of the murdered. Not so nice. And even a Ferris wheel, and I'm sorry to trouble your sleep tonight with this, but a Ferris wheel with boxcars on it, with concentration camp names on it, rotating. And what the artist called a Ferris wheel that would rotate between the carnivalesque and the genocidal, whatever that means. So, in other words, everybody had an idea. And of course, until yesterday, I'm still getting packages from people, with even better ideas. In March 1995, organizers announced that the jurors, and the jurors in this case were composed of the three groups of organizers, the Berlin Senate, the Bundestag, and the Citizens Initiative Committee headed by Jekyll and Leah Roche, that they had finally chosen a design. And their winning design was announced with great pomp and circumstance and was a complete disaster, but they didn't know it at the time. They announced that they had chosen Christina Jakob Marx's design of a 100-meter square slab of concrete, 23 feet thick, tilted from one end at a meter high to 11 meters high, at the other end inscribed with the names of 4.5 million murdered Jews, figuring that they could only find or recover that many names of victims. And then strewn, inexplicably, with 18 boulders. 18's not a bad number, 18 chai in Hebrew gematria, but strewn with boulders imported from Masada, the site in Israel of a mass Jewish suicide, a collective suicide between about and around 77 in the Common Era, when the Romans had basically now sacked Jerusalem, and this was the last remnant of Jews which decided to commit suicide rather than being taken slaves back to Rome. So they were, in other words, going to take emblems from a collective Jewish suicide and put them right in the middle of a national Holocaust memorial in Berlin. And it made no sense at all. They thought they were just basically making a gesture to Israel without understanding that it's impossible to commemorate Europe's murdered Jews in any image, you know, to do with a collective Jewish suicide, which it was not. Within hours, I got, my fax machine was going. I had pictures of this being faxed to me from all the newspapers asking for a comment. And I commented. I said, well, it's well-intentioned, but, you know, it's impossible. I mean, it's gigantic, you know, tilted, you know, gravestone with 4.5 million names, I guess arranged alphabetically. It's going to look like a gigantic phone book. You'll never recover all the names. And you can't, and these 18 boulders from Masada, it's impossible. And this was not a hard critique to make. Just about every cultural critic in Germany made the same critique. And within days, Ignaz Bubis, then head of the Gemeinde, the Jewish Gemeinde community in Germany, told Kohl that he didn't want this. Kohl threw up his hands and voided the entire competition. It was a mess. They did show all 528 designs in the grand exhibition, and this I thought was great. Can, you know, make a competition like this every year and show the designs, show why it can't be done, in fact. And I wanted to, in fact, suggest that this was going to be a paralyzing problem. It was an essentially German problem, and that maybe they should just keep that space open, a great void in the landscape, you know, never to be filled, but a void to commemorate the void created by the German, the Nazi regime. Well, after yet another year of stormy debate, the organizers called a series of colloquia in January, March, and April 1997 to address all the issues surrounding the memorial. We've got to solve this problem. They said they were just driven to find a solution again. And driven by politics, too. Kohl didn't want to look like he'd failed here. And so they got Germany's best culture critics, artists, art historians, politicians. It was convened by the Bundestag, Speaker of the Bundestag had put the whole thing together. And for the last one, they called me to give kind of a keynote address to the entire, kind of this huge audience, just to put their German problem into context. And here I could reassure them. I said, well, you know what? The last competition, you had 528 submissions. Just multiply 528 by the thousands of hours spent by these artists and architects on each commission, and you've already accomplished hundreds of thousands of hours of memorial work here. And I think it's spectacular. I would be very, very suspicious if you had solved your problem. But you have not solved it because it's unsolvable. And this is your dilemma. Poland has its dilemmas. Israel has its problems. America has its problems when it goes to remember. You just have the hardest problem. And so I told the stories of Israel's Day of Remembrance and how it came about and the fraught debate in the Israeli Knesset, you know, 1951 and 52, between 48 and 51, trying to find the right date that would please all factions. The ways that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum almost didn't get built as well. It was also conceived in political time, you know, as you probably remember, conceived by Stuart Eisenstadt, then Chief of Staff for President Jimmy Carter, to, if you will, appease now a distraught Jewish constituency, angered by the administration's sale of F-16 fighter planes to Saudi Arabia. It was a political move. I mean, a great museum came out of it, but its genesis was in political time, in real time. And so, in a way, they were reassured. I said that don't feel bad about it, just keep searching. Don't find an answer, in fact. Just keep asking the questions. And I said that maybe that's what we should do, is just articulate the questions, after all. And then you could see kind of lights going on. And now they're interested. I mean, now I was approaching something Hegelian. You know, create just this back and forth, a question and answer, questions and answers that provoke more questions. And so with this, I went home, and the next day I got a phone call from Peter Radunsky, the Speaker of the Berlin Senate, who said, I've been now commissioned by the Chancellor, he was a member of the CDU, to put together a Findungskommission, and I would like you to be the 5th member. Well, who are the others, I said. And he gave me their names. There was Dieter Ronte, who was the director of the Kunstmuseum in Bonn, Werner Hofmann, the director of the Hamburg Museum, Christoph Stutzel, the director of the Deutsches Historisches Museum, the German Historical Museum in Berlin, the largest museum then in Berlin, And Joseph Paul Kleihues, a famous architect there who had actually overseen much of the rebuilding of Berlin after the war, especially in the 70s, and had also chaired commissions he had chaired the jury for the Jewish Museum in Berlin, which in fact was now being built. And then he asked if I would join. I said, well, but I don't think it can be done. Why me? And I said, well, precisely because you don't think it can be done, you will show us how to do it. And I had to admire this Hegelian logic myself a little bit. So, well, then now I'm thinking selfishly. Well, I write about these things. I've been writing about this for a long time. Why not write about it from the inside? You know, I mean, so I'm thinking there's obviously a book in this. Nothing will ever come of it. And I basically tell the story of how it never came to be. And so I agreed. But I also agreed on a number of very specific conditions. I had to address all the problems, I mean, all the reasons I didn't want the memorial, in fact, and to make its problems part of our presses. In fact, I had to admit that I had been an absolute skeptic. Rather than looking for a centralized monument, I was satisfied with the debate itself. Better, I thought, to take all these millions of Deutschmarks and to put them into preserving memory, say, at Dachau, and preserving all the concentration camp sites and the archives around the country. And I also felt that because no single site can speak for all the victims, much less both victims and perpetrators, the state should be reminding its citizens to visit the many and diverse memorials. I didn't want one single place to take the place of all the other sites, kind of alleviating the need to visit all these various sites around Germany and Europe. Here I also had to admit that with this position I had made many friends in Germany and was making a good career out of skepticism. Most of my colleagues also shared my fear that Chancellor Kohl's government wanted what we were calling a memorial to Europe's murdered Jews as a great burial slab for the 20th century, a hermetically sealed vault for the ghosts of Germany's past. Instead of inciting memory of murdered Jews, we suspected this memorial would become a place where Germans would come dutifully to unshoulder their memorial burden so that they could move freely and unencumbered into the 21st century. A finished monument would, in effect, finish memory itself. On the one hand, we need to acknowledge the need for and the political necessity for this German Holocaust Memorial, but at the same time, we had to recognize the difficulty of answering this need in a single space. If the aim of a national memorial in Berlin is to draw a bottom line underneath this era, so that a reunified Germany can move unencumbered into the future, then we should make this clear, at least make that one of the aims of the memorial. But if the aim is to remember for perpetuity that Germany had murdered 6 million human beings because they were Jews, then this monument must also embody the intractable questions at the heart of such memory, rather than claiming to answer them. Otherwise, we all fear that whatever form the monument takes would not mark the memory of Europe's murdered Jews so much as bury this memory altogether. And in fact, I thought these were persuasive arguments against the monument, and to this day I'm still ambivalent about the actual role this memorial will play. But then I had to recognize that this was also a position that only an academic bystander could afford to take. Somebody whose primary interest lay in perpetuating the process. And something had to give. As instructive as the memorial process had been, I felt it had still not really chastened a new generation of xenophobic neo-Nazis whose very existence depended on forgetting the crimes of the Nazis. In other words, it's very hard to be a neo-Nazi if you remember the crimes of former Nazis. You can't premise your existence, your positive existence, on the crimes of your forebears, in effect. And while the memorial debate generated plenty of shame in Germans, it was largely the shame they felt for an unseemly argument, not the shame for the crime itself. And this began to bother me. We'd actually become so preoccupied with the questions and the issues at the heart of the process that we had increasingly become kind of indifferent to the memory of Jews murdered. And that the process itself, the debate itself, had become its own self-contained, kind of self-congratulatory inner debate, I felt. And in fact, it was just the self-righteous and somewhat self-congratulatory tenor of the position that had begun to make me very uneasy. Our so-called unimpeachably skeptical approach to monuments was now beginning to sound just a little too certain of itself. My German comrades in skepticism, in fact, called themselves the secessionists. a slightly self-flattering gesture to the turn of the century movement of artists, many of whom would be Jewish victims of the Nazis. What had begun as an intellectually rigorous interrogation of the memorial was now taking on the shape of a circular, self-enclosed argument. And here I also realized that now my personal stake was going to change and that I was now being asked to get off the fence. And so before answering Radwanski, I had to ask myself a series of questions. I didn't answer immediately. I took a couple of days. And I asked, did I want Germany to return its capital to Berlin without publicly and visibly acknowledging what had happened there the last time Germany was governed from Berlin? How indeed could I set foot in a new German capital built on the presumption of inadvertent historical amnesia always created with new buildings? And basically, as Adorno had eventually corrected his well-intentioned but eventually hackneyed formulation, nach Auschwitz, I mean, after Auschwitz, poetry is barbaric, perhaps it was also time for some of us to come down from our perch of holy dialectics and take a real position. But now, as one of the newly appointed arbiters of German Holocaust memory, I found that I also was in a new and strange position. The skeptics whispered asides echoed my own apprehensions. A mere decoration, this American Jew, a sop to authority and so-called expertise. I asked myself, was I invited as an academic authority on memorials, or are they looking for a Jewish blessing on whatever design was finally chosen? If I can be credited for helping arbitrate official memory, can I also be held liable for another bad design? In fact, just where is the line between my role as arbiter of German memory and my part in a fraught political process which I couldn't even begin to grasp, in fact. And then I found that my role was changing from kind of an interpreter, an explicator, to an arbiter, and eventually to an advocate. When they appointed me spokesman eventually, my job was to explain the rationale of the memorial we chose, which I'll attempt to do here, and you'll have to judge for yourselves as to whether or not it's adequate, I think. So in the end, I agreed, but only on the condition that we write a very precise conceptual plan for the memorial. The first competition had a very vague précis. In fact, they basically avoided all the difficult issues in order to reach a consensus about just building the memorial at all. And I said, instead of avoiding the issues, let's put all the difficulties right at the center of the process. We would need to be clear that this memorial would not displace the hundreds of other memorial sites, and that a memorial to Europe's murdered Jews could not speak for the Nazis' other victims. And this was a big debate in Germany. Reinhard Koselleck, a good friend of mine, in fact suggested that any memorial to the Jews alone would necessarily create a hierarchy of victims and their significance. And this is an argument. This is a big debate. But what we wanted to do is remember a specific group, knowing that this particular memorial would have to inspire memorials to other groups of victims, so that you have a conglomerate. Each of these groups murdered for very different reasons, and the consequences of these mass murders being very different on their eventual constitution as groups in Europe. Nor should the memorial hide the impossible questions driving the debate. It should instead reflect the terms of the debate, what we regarded as the insufficiency of memorials, the contemporary generation's skeptical view of any official memory, and its inevitably self-aggrandizing ways. After all, I've been arguing for years that a new generation of artists and architects, such as Boltanski or Rademacher or Horst Hoheisel or Michel Ullmann or Steen Schnock, Jochen Gerst, Daniel Liebeskind, had turned their skepticism of the monumental into a radical counter-monumentality. In challenging and flouting every one of the memorial's conventions, their designs have reflected an essentially German ambivalence toward self-indictment. So maybe if the government insisted on a memorial in Berlin to Europe's murdered Jews, then maybe it too could embody the same counter-memorial critique. I mean, this is a little bit utopian, but I figured it would actually be so difficult to address these issues that nothing could be found. So this would be a way, in effect, of dooming the project by putting the answer, or putting the questions right up in front. So rather than prescribing a form, we described a concept that had to take into account what the definition of the Holocaust and its significance, Nazi Germany's role as perpetrator, and current reunified Germany's role as rememberer, the contemporary generation's relationship to Holocaust memory, the aesthetic debate swirling around the memorial. Instead of providing answers, we ask questions. What are the national reasons for remembrance? Are they redemptory? Are they part of a mourning process? Are they pedagogical? Are they self-aggrandizing? Or are they inspiration against contemporary xenophobia? To what national and social ends will this memorial be built? And we asked this question explicitly. I'm not so sure any German can answer, but we wanted the artist to address this question. Just how compensatory a gesture will it be? Will it be a place for Jews to mourn lost Jews, or a place for Germans to mourn lost Jews, or a place for Jews to remember what Germans once did to them? These questions must be made part of the process so that let them be asked by the artists in their designs, even if they cannot finally be answered. And this was finally, I think, the breakthrough. We didn't invite these artists to answer the questions, we invited them to articulate these questions in their, formally in their designs. And it was with that, in fact, that we received the submissions from the artists we invited. We also had to address two further concerns which almost paralyzed the process again at the very end. Should this be a contemplative site only, or also pedagogically inclined? That is, would this memorial serve as a center of gravity for the dozens of other memorials and pedagogical centers, or would it somehow displace them and even usurp their memorial authority? Because we didn't see Holocaust memory in Germany as a zero-sum project, we concluded that there was indeed room in Berlin's new landscape for both commemorative spaces and for pedagogical spaces. In other words, this wouldn't take the place of the museums at, say, at the Wannsee Villa, or at the Gestapo-Gelände, or at Buchenwald, or any of the archives, that in addition to these archives and museums and houses of pedagogy, you can and maybe must also have contemplative sites. The question would never be whether it would be only a memorial or museum, but whether in addition to these existing sites, there was also room as well for contemplative space, and we agreed that there was. In fact, though still suspicious of the monument, we also began to see how important it would be to add a space to Germany's restored capital deliberately designed to remember the mass murder of Jews. This would not be a space for memory designed by the killers, basically as the concentration camps are, but it would be a space designed specifically as a memorial site, one denoting the current generation's deliberate attempt to remember. Of course, the government would have to continue supporting all these other memorials and museums, but here we felt that to build a memorial apart from these sites would not be the kind of the passive recognition and preservation of the past. It would be a deliberate act of remembrance, a statement that memory must be created for the next generation and not only preserved. That is, every generation must create its own reasons for remembering and find its own reasons for remembering, and this would not be just the passive preservation of sites already installed. And this actually allowed us then to go forward with the whole project. As you see, I mean, we were all quite skeptical of the process, and it was only after we'd worked these questions out could we agree, to go on. And that's what we did. We invited, in fact, 25 artists and architects, the best ones we could imagine. We had to negotiate this between ourselves, of course. I wanted Stian Schnock and Horst Hoheisel. They wanted others, and in the end we came up with a good list, which included people like Rachel Whiteread, who had won the competition for Memorial in Vienna, Daniel Liebeskind, Jochen Gertz, figurative artists like Markus Lupertz, a whole realm of both plastic artists, architects, traditional architects, deconstructivist architects, Rebecca Horn, conceptual artists. I mean, kind of the best we had, and figure, well, we'll just ask the best to do what they do, and trust somehow for the artists to give us something we can live with. And in the end, I felt that the presses, in fact, was justified by the submissions. Of the 25 we invited, 19 submitted designs, and then we were given a very kind of a very tight schedule. They wanted us to choose from these, and none of this, quelled the raging controversy. In fact, the newspapers were full of op-ed pieces within days of our announcing who the artists, were. Who elected the search committee anyway? And so, where did these people come from, and why these artists, and why this site, and why not another open competition? And all these were good questions. And this is what I would have been writing if I'd still been writing about the process. In fact, but they had. In fact, I realized now I was co-opted. See, I could no longer oppose. They took maybe the main opponents of the competition and put us, to work making it. And in the end, we felt that the process as we define it was then vindicated by the strength of the designs we received. So here, why don't I show the designs, and I won't discuss all of them, but I can tell you about a few of them, and you'll see with your own eyes that again, it's a mix. These are not all great. Some of them, it turns out, I think a couple were really great and were buildable. Let's see, do I have a clicker up here? Or? Yep, thanks. Let's see, I think we need to turn the... And is the slide projector on, in fact? I think we need to turn it on. Just turn on the... Okay. Great, yeah, all the way up. Of course, the very first design here, as you see, is just to leave the space empty and to put up little signs around the edges saying, oops, how'd that happen? I think this might be a somewhat automatic something here. Switching by itself. Anyway, so they just put up signs saying that here is the empty site of the National Memorial for Europe's murdered Jews. Since no design could be adequate, we leave the space empty. This is Rolf Storz and Hans-Jürgen Wöhrle. Another design we actually liked theoretically, what they call the cobblestone Autobahn, kilometer. Whoops. Why is this going here? I think there must be some timer on there. I'm not sure what it's doing. Okay, anyway, they propose taking a kilometer of the Autobahn just below Kassel, where about 40 million cars a year go, and pave it over in cobblestones, slowing traffic to a traitorously slow, 30 kilometers an hour, over which no doubt German motorists would be cursing the Jews as well as remembering them, for 1 kilometer. And this is a conceptual piece by a photographer who had taken many images, tourist images, in fact. Reinhard Matz had conceived this. And we kind of liked it, in fact, because, in fact, this was taking one of Hitler's monuments, if you will, or one of Hitler's legacies, and perverting it, and making this, too, basically a Hitlerian monument to his murdered Jews. But it wasn't designed for Berlin. Right now, it is being proposed for a site south of Kassel, and I'll be working on actually realizing it south of Kassel. The Germans will hate me for this, too, I'm sure. Christina Jakob Marx proposed this kind of benign and relatively unexciting design, kind of an abstracted design of Europe with kind of a Stele commemorating every site of Jewish life, capital of Jewish life in Europe during the war. Again, there's nothing really wrong with it, but there's just not much going on. I mean, it's just kind of inanimate and kind of dead. Let's see, I won't talk about all. There were a few designs like this one, kind of broken walls, another kind of broken wall or a broken house here. And then there were several designs, in fact, in which artists began now to take into account, I mean, these were geometric minimalists, kind of by trade. This is the kind of work that they did. This particular one, in fact, by Gerhard Merz, was interesting. It was kind of an open-top mausoleum. This is a side cut view, a cutout view, in which there would be a gigantic hole built into the ground. It would be a memorial built around, if you will, negative space or around void, so that you could walk into the mausoleum. There would just be light coming from the ceiling up on top, and you could look into the ground into a gigantic hole. This design, as well as this one, again, built around space, if you will, and also reflecting these particular artists' preoccupation with geometric abstraction. We felt that in both these cases, and in this one as well, that there was a certain kind of a self-certainty in these perfect right angles and these perfect cubes. We wanted to find something, in fact, which would disorient, not orient. And these seemed, in their perfect angles, to mend memory in some ways, even though they're doing it around gigantic empty spaces, which we liked. But again, this generation of artists, the Saul LeWitt generation, is very much concerned with the cube, with the angle, with the edge, like this. And then we found one, in fact, that was clearly indebted, if you will, to Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, something carved out of the ground. And this began to approach something counter-monumental, if you will. Maya Lin's memorial really is America's great counter-monument. I mean, how does America remember veterans, whom they spit at and wanted to forget in some way at the end of the war? They built Maya Lin's memorial, a black negative form built into the ground in a city dominated by white neoclassic phallic monuments built high up into the sky. And this designer also decided to build kind of this compass, if you will, in which we would walk down and there would be room for inscriptions on the side. But also it seemed just enough of if you will, a copy. At one point, people wanted to invite Maya Lin, in fact. We already know somebody who made a great memorial in America. Let's ask her. They really wanted to be reassured, by somebody already at work. Rebecca Horn proposed something, again, right in the middle of her kind of work. It's a kinetic piece, but for all kinds of reasons. She had it's kind of almost a stylus built into the ground, which would quiver slightly in the wind. People would walk down this spiral trail. There would be a glass case wall around the edge here, and there would be ash behind it. Not human ash, but she wanted something inanimate or inert. But the reference would just be too literal. We wanted to stay away from anything with any kind of direct kind of iconographic. No barbed wire, no blood, no ash. Basically, we didn't want something that would evoke in those ways. We wanted it to evoke conceptually. And then Marcus Lupertz made a memorial design that he hoped would be kind of a reconciliation between Jews and Christians. He took Rachel, a figure of Rachel, put her on a small hillock here. The figure itself is about 30 feet tall, but she's relatively disfigured. She's missing an arm, and basically the Rachel is the mother of Jews and Christians. But of course, in Jewish tradition, Rachel Imenu is really the mother of Jews, and this was a figure, in fact, which would have been forbidden viewing to about 1/2 of the Jews murdered in Europe, the religious Jews, and the Haredim, the Hasidim, who could have had to shield their eyes, rather than looking at this figure of, Rachel Imenu, now up on a hill, kind of almost like an idolatry, if you will. Tzvi Hecker, an Israeli architect, designed something called Pages of the Book, in which you would have these doors, these portals to walk through. They would be kind of broken pages, very low benches, almost like Shiva benches, mourning benches in Jewish tradition. Hebrew lettering, but he wasn't specific where this lettering would come from. Would it be from Torah? Would it be from a liturgical text? He wasn't clear. Conceptually, we like the idea of the pages of the book, remembering the Jews in the image of the book, in the image of that thing which made the Jews a people, the remembered relationship to a past as textualized in the book or in the Torah. But formally, we thought the design was in the end too diffuse and was not clear enough. And then Danik Haravan resubmitted his design for a yellow star in the shape of basically a flower garden of yellow flowers in the shape of a yellow star. And we did like that this would be a garden that would have to be tended year-round. This would be something that the Germans would have to take care of. It would also be a garden which would reflect the change of seasons. It would be a constantly animate site where in spring the flowers would bloom and then they would wither in the fall and die. They'd have to be maybe plowed up or cut back. It might be covered by snow in the winter, so you'd have a palimpsest of the star. But in effect, what he was doing was taking the so-called badge of shame, the yellow Jewish star, which Jews were forced to put on in the ghettos, and taking this badge and applying it now to the German landscape. So in effect, it would become now Germany's badge of shame. which then there's some kind of poetic justice in this. But we had to ask the question, would the Jews have wanted Jewish life, 1,000 years of Jewish life, remembered in this sole emblem of shame, assigned them by the Nazis? And we had to answer no. Would this be a way to commemorate 1,000 years of Jewish life? That is, only by that badge of shame, which in fact was a Nazi emblem after all, given to the Jews. A way to turn it back on the Germans perhaps, but still a Nazi emblem. And so we rejected it. Jochen Gertz proposed an interactive plaza of these aluminum poles with diode lights in 39 languages, all asking warum, or why. To this question, visitors would find their own answers in this document house in the shape of an ear here at the bottom. They would inscribe their answers on pieces of paper, which would be then converted by a computer into engraved stones, and then they would take these answers, engrave them in stones, and put them in the plaza. So it would be a constantly growing and evolving plaza with the answers people would propose. So they would have to actually learn something about this. But something about this struck me as being off, and what it was the question why. We can ask what happened, and we can ask who did what to whom, and how it happened, and we know these things. Historically, we know exactly what happened and how it happened. But the why question is a metaphysical question, in effect. It's a religious question, and the only people who can tell us why are the killers. So in effect, we have to invite the killer's rationale for murdering Jews. The Nazis can tell us why. They told us why they were murdering the Jews. They had their reasons. I mean, not good reasons. They had their reasons. But that answer invites kind of the perpetrator's logic on the one hand, and it also invites kind of a metaphysical speculation on the other, neither of which I felt was adequate. And then I recalled that line in Primo Levi, of course, when the guard struck one of Primo Levi's inmate friends, and for no good reason, and Levi asked the guard why. And of course the guard answered, "Hier ist kein Warum." Here there is no why. I mean, why is the inappropriate question to ask here. You invite logic, and this logic may not be a logic that you understand. So we liked this, again, we liked the interaction, but formally we felt it looked a little bit like a trade fair. All these questions, all these things went against it. And then we looked at Daniel Libeskind. Now, Jochen Gertz, Daniel Libeskind, and the next two, in fact, were the 4 finalists for the competition. Daniel Libeskind has designed the Jewish Museum in Berlin, a huge structure which is bisected by 6 voids, or actually trisected in several places by 6 voids. It was almost as if he had extended a void all the way from the museum into this site in the shape of a huge wall itself, now broken and breached in several places. And then he's taken the site, which we really liked, and ran it over the road into the Tiergarten so that left point would go right to the Goethe Monument. And we kind of like this idea of the memorial space taking over a part of Berlin. It's sprawling out of its boundaries, if you will, so that even cars would have to now be going through this space. But it was also huge, and we had to consider what it meant, what it would mean to assign both the Jewish Museum and the Berlin Memorial to a single person. I mean, it's a question we shouldn't have to ask, and I guess if it were a great enough design, we would have said yes. But there was a little bit of putting all the responsibility for memory in one person's hands, in this case, one man's hands, a great architect, and he really actually wanted the design. I mean, he was quite insistent. He presented it as well as he could, and he had a beautiful board. This is the board he presented us, so you can see the Brandenburger Tor, the Potsdamer Platz on the side. It was gorgeously laid out. But in the end, we felt that the 2 that followed were the great ones. In fact, here, in weighing, kind of all these things back and forth, we found in Gesine Weinmiller's design, she had taken 18 segments of sandstone, huge bits of segments of wall composed of stacked sandstone blocks, a little bit like the Kotel, a little bit like the Western Wall, the fragment of the Jerusalem Temple. And in these 18, again 18 being the Hebrew gematria for Chai, for life, she scattered them randomly throughout this square so that everybody would have to find their own way through. You'd have a sense of brokenness, a sense of randomness on the one hand, a sense of empty space. You would have to descend into this space. The cityscape would kind of recede or sink now below the horizon of the square itself. And there would be all kinds of room on the walls around for writing inscriptions to, so we would know exactly what was being commemorated here. And then she laid these out not so randomly after all. She mentioned that if you walk along these ramparts and you come to this corner right there and look into the square, that by a perspectival illusion, these pieces will actually congeal into a broken Star of David. And the moment you move away from it, it falls apart. So there is a gimmick if you are suspicious of such things, or if you want, something like this would remain unsaid. It wouldn't be stated. People would have to find this out themselves. But there would be the sense of the star, if you will, composing and decomposing, depending on where you stood around this square. And in fact, we thought it was interesting. It worked. It was about absence. It was light-handed. It demanded a viewer participation that would create and destroy a star. And she was a 35-year-old woman, an architect in Berlin, well-known in Berlin. But as it turns out, I think that she was finally too German for the public, who felt that they wanted instead a famous design, or a design by famous architect, Peter Eisenman, and Richard Serra, his collaborator, in this field of pillars. Peter Eisenman and Richard Serra collaborated to suggest that 4,200, that is 4,200 pillars be built, ranging from ground height to as high as 5 meters tall. That is, say, 17 or 18 feet tall. And each one would be at 3 degrees off center, meaning that you would wander in and probably never quite find your way out. I mean, it'd be a little bit labyrinthine, which was a problem. But conceptually, what they wanted to take the individual form of mourning, that is the matseva or the tombstone, and collectivize it to show that the emblems of individual mourning can never be adequate to commemorating a mass murder. But in effect, by collecting all of these into a great waving field, they would basically be a waving field of stones, of pillars. They would create a place that would be massive. It would allow people to find their own ways through memory. They would also be defeated by memory, we felt. In the end, we proposed these two designs, this one and Weinmiller's design, and through a series of kind of political maneuverings, Leah Roche was going to propose Jochen Gertz's design. We proposed two in order to defeat her one, in effect. We were charged with finding the design, but she now didn't want, in effect, the power out of her hands. So there was this kind of an internal battle. We did propose these. The public also got Jochen Gertz's and Liebeskind's design as kind of a final four, but it came down to this one, and Weinmiller's, and eventually the public came down on the side of Serra and Eisenman's design. I had qualms about the design. In fact, preferred slightly Weinmiller's design over Serra and Eisenman's, because there was something really big, bombastic, truly monumental in this design that made me uneasy. And part of it was that it was literally dangerous. This was a design that people could walk into and maybe never get out of. And that's always part of Serra's work. Serra makes dangerous work, dangerous looking work, and actually physically, literally dangerous works that occasionally topple on workers putting them up. I mean, he wants that kind of ominous threat here, and there's something okay with that conceptually, but literally, do you want a memorial that actually kills people when they run out over the tops, when they wander in and never come out? And I suggested at one point that this might become the Venus flytrap of Holocaust memorials. In other words, it might consume as many people as it would be commemorating. And we said, we can accept this, and we'd like that the public has taken a position, and Helmut Kohl favored this design very much. And so we said, we will accept it, but you must make some changes. So we asked them to scale it down, to reduce the size of the pillars themselves and the number. we didn't want a memorial that would defeat people. We wanted a memorial in which you could actually see other people remembering here. We wanted a memorial that would actually bring people into kind of a human-scaled relationship with memory, not something that would tower over them and humble them. This was not meant to humiliate rememberers, but meant to confront rememberers with their own memory, if you will. So Eisenman said, great, whatever you want, I will do. He and Sarah went to visit Chancellor Kohl. This would have been in January 1998, when in fact Kohl said, we want this, the one we want. These are the design changes we want to make. And Eisenman said, no problem. I'm the architect, you're the client, whatever you want, I'll do for you. Sarah said, well, there is a problem. I'm a sculptor. What you see is what you get. It has its own logic, and if you change it, it's not mine anymore. I mean, it's, maybe architects, will do what clients want, but artists don't do that kind of thing. So he withdrew from the process, leaving only Eisenman as the designer here. Eisenman went back and, in fact, scaled everything down, and these are the revised images here you see. And as you see, it is kind of a waving field, almost like a waving field of wheat in these stones. And I think in the redesign, in fact, it was much, much stronger in unexpected ways. People could now go out into these stones knee-deep, waist-deep, or even shoulder-deep, and see other rememberers. You're in your own space, but you're also within sight of other people at the same time. No two paths through this field will ever be the same. Everybody, in effect, will have to create their own path of memory, their own narrative path into their own place, in which they will remember clearly in their own way. All of these stones will remain blank-faced. There will be nothing written on them, so they will not be really tombstones, but they will only kind of iconographically suggest tombstones, and clearly this suggests a cemetery. I mean, it's got a cemetery motif here. And then the elections loomed, and Kohl, it was quite clear, was going to have a big election problem. The new SPD candidate for chancellor and his designate for culture, Minister of Culture, Michael Naumann, both Schroeder and Naumann opposed the memorial. Naumann was asked on the day he was named as minister designate, this was still during the elections itself, well, what do you think of the memorial? And his first words came to haunt him, in effect. I mean, basically he was very, very honest, but what he said was that, no, I don't want the memorial for two reasons. First, he was skeptical of any monument's adequacy to commemorate the Holocaust, and then he went on to cite all of the critic James Young's reasons against memorials. And he didn't know that I was now on the commission to find the memorial. And then he said that he believed that, in effect, this would be a suspension of guilt in art. He didn't want it. And second, even though he had not yet seen Eisenman's design, he had seen pictures of it and felt that it had a certain Speer-like monumentality, was the words he used. He was very honest, but this comparison of Eisenman's design to something Speer made suddenly raised all kinds of questions about, his judgment. Is he comparing Eisenman to Speer? I mean, is that he's calling Eisenman a Nazi architect? I mean, what's going on here? And he began to kind of, back up, and he was basically on the defensive for the rest of the election. And then when the SPD was elected, he continued to suggest that, in fact, there shouldn't be a memorial so much as a pedagogical center, and basically ignored all the arguments, that had already, the entire history of the project to that point. And in the end, Michael Blumenthal, the director of the Jewish Museum, called Naumann and Eisenman together and said, look, let's find some modus here. Built into the coalition agreement between the Greens and the Reds, of the Green-Red coalition, the Social Democrats and the Green Party, was an agreement to vote on the memorial. The Greens now wanted the memorial, and they wanted Eisenman's design. They backed it completely. So Joschka Fischer joined the government on the condition that the entire Bundestag would vote on it as soon as possible. The Bundestag favored the memorial. They were going to make it. So now Naumann and Schroeder had to find a way to get on the right side of things. And so they proposed a kind of a compromise solution. Naumann said, I will support the memorial in principle if Eisenman supports in principle the possibility of adding to it a huge museum. So Naumann then proposed a gigantic museum of a 1 million book library, which would, I guess, take all the books out of all the archives in Berlin and put them on this site. It would become like basically a Holocaust museum on the site of the memorial itself. Eisenman went home, generated a computer graphic that would approximate something like this. So-called, this was supposed to be just between him and Naumann, but in fact the press got hold of this picture and they said, what's going on here? The Minister of Culture and the architect are making something up completely out of nothing now. And everybody was furious when this picture got into the press, proposing the changes, that now they're going to have both a museum and a memorial. And they had to go back, and it went back and forth until they had to back down and say, in fact, all we really have is Eisenman 2. This revised design. We do not have permission to make a museum there. And in March 1998, in fact, they asked me to come and, 1999, they asked me to come and address the Bundestag Committee on Media and Culture, and just to put in perspective. So I spoke, Michael Naumann spoke, and we basically, at that time, told the story of the memorial from start to where we are now. So we want to vote, but we don't know what to vote on. Where are we? Are we voting on Eisenman 3, on Eisenman 2, on Eisenman 1? Are we going to have a new competition? So I just told the story and said, you've asked us to give you a recommendation. The Findungskommission recommends Eisenman 2, this design, and for these reasons. We feel, in fact, it does not solve the questions. It creates a huge open space. It allows rememberers to come and remember in many of their own terms, but still guided by a principle of kind of mourning as constructed in cemeteries. There is space around the edge now, and we provide a long rationale. You can accept it or reject it, but this is what you now have. So what should we do? And I said, I would vote in 3 parts. First, vote on whether or not you want a memorial. If you want a memorial, vote on whether or not you want Eisenman's design. You asked us to give you one, this is what we've given you. You don't have to like it, but vote it up or down. And after you voted on Eisenman's design, then vote on whether or not you want to add a document center, a so-called Ort des Information, a place of information to this site. If you want that, then you'll have to figure out how big or how small it will be. And so, in fact, last June 25th, the Parliament voted exactly on these issues. And they voted the memorial into being. And here I would just like to read you the language of the actual vote, so that you know exactly what now is officially mandated by the Bundestag. There was 314 votes to 209 with 14 abstentions. They voted 1, that the Federal Republic of Germany will erect in Berlin a memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe on the site of the former ministerial gardens in the middle of Berlin. Yes. Second, the design of Peter Eisenman's Field of Pillars will be realized, as well as a small place of information that will detail the fate of the victims and the authentic sites of destruction. And third, a public foundation will be established by the Bundestag to oversee the completion of the memorial. It will be composed of representatives of Berlin, the Bundestag, the City of Berlin, the Citizens Initiative, and there will also be a curatorium established of historians to write the exact narrative. Now, this was in fact approved, and the newspapers then asked, well, what do I think? And now, do you think the work is done? And I said that no, in fact, now, I'm not sorry the debate's finally over, because in fact only half the debate is over. We have a design, but maybe it was much easier to find the design than it will be to end up with a narrative describing exactly what it is to be remembered and why you are now remembering. So now that the Parliament had decided to give Holocaust memory a place in Berlin, an even more difficult job would now await the organizers, defining exactly what is to be remembered in this waving field of pillars. What will Germany's national Holocaust narrative be? How will the memorial text actually read? Who will write it, and to whom will it be written? The question of historical content begins at precisely the moment the question of memorial design ends. Memory, which has followed history, will now be followed by still further historical debate. Now, in the end, by choosing to create a commemorative space in the center of Berlin, a place empty of housing, commerce, or recreation, the Bundestag reminds Germany and the world at large of the self-inflicted void at the heart of German culture and consciousness. And in the end, I believe this is a courageous and difficult act of contrition on the part of the government and reflects Germany's newfound willingness to act on such memory as it did in the summer of 1999 in Kosovo, and not be merely paralyzed by such memory. And as you know, I mean, German foreign policy was to a great extent paralyzed by Holocaust memory. They forbade their soldiers to serve outside of German soil, basically, until NATO invited them in, and they participated then in the intervention against an ongoing genocide, or the almost immediate genocide of Kosovar Albanians. But because the murdered Jews can respond to this gesture only with this massive silence, the burden of response now falls on living Germans, who in their memorial visits will be asked to recall the mass murder of a people once perpetrated in their name, the absolute void this destruction has left behind, and their own responsibility for memory itself. For whether Germans like it or not, in addition to their nation's great accomplishments over the last several centuries, they will also always be identified as that nation which launched the deadliest genocide in human history, which started a world war that eventually killed some 50 million human beings, and which used this war to screen this deliberate mass murder of some 6 million European Jews. It's not a proud memory, but neither has any other nation attempted to make such a crime perpetrated in its name part of its national identity. For this space will always remind Germany and the world at large of just this self-inflicted void at the heart of German culture and consciousness, a void that at once defines national identity, even as it threatens such identity with its own implosion. And with those words, I'm happy to take questions, and thank you for your attention. It's still being debated. There's a very small budget for it in the Bundestag. I had dinner actually about 5 nights ago with Michael Naumann in Amherst, where we got to catch up. And he's still pushing for as large a place of information as possible. He would like something approaching a museum. The Bundestag budget committees are not going to give him that budget. He's resigned to its being a relatively modest or small document house, but it will be a place probably built partly underground, or at least, if anything shows, it will be along one of the margins of the site itself. It'll be a place that basically tells a short history of what happened, a short history of the Third Reich, a short history of their other victims. It will put into context. Naumann's confident, and I think a little bit over-optimistic, that this will be done and written within the year. But the curatorium he's appointing, German historians primarily, I know them, and they're having a tough time deciding exactly what it is they're going to be writing here. But Naumann's sure that they'll find a consensus as to what it will be. So this will probably be something of several hundred square meters altogether. There will be a permanent exhibit of sorts. It will not be a museum approaching anywhere the size of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum or Yad Vashem, but probably a single, almost a single room, perhaps divided into 2 sections, describing exactly what it is being commemorated here. He just didn't want a site which was supposed to be self-evident of memory, and I can understand this. So added now to the site will be a place of information that will also probably evolve over time as newer histories are written, as newer preoccupations come into view. A generation in 40 years will probably ask different historical questions, and such a site in fact will continue to evolve to suggest perhaps new significance in these events. Significance much different in 40 years from what they are now. It's crucial to note that this memorial really couldn't have been built until now. Most of the generation of perpetrators, being gone, and the generation now firmly removed by what they call the grace of their birth, their late birth, if you will, now responsible for remembering not their own crimes, but for remembering the crimes of their forebears. And that's a great distinction. Very difficult, again, for people to remember their own crimes, but not as hard as we found now to remember the crimes of our forebears. So this generation now, in Weizsäcker's words, is responsible for memory, but not for the crimes themselves. So you ask, where is it? It's going to be built. What size and shape right now? Eisenman is literally designing 3 proposals. to submit. One very big one middle one, and one fairly small one. When he gives their cost estimates, the Bundestag committee, this Stiftung, this foundation, will weigh them all and decide what it is they can build. And they will be doing that within the next 6 to 8 months. Well, about 2/3 voted for, a third against. The mayor of Berlin, as you know, who didn't attend the cornerstone laying ceremonies this last January 27th, still opposes it. He doesn't want Berlin turned into what he calls a landscape of remorse, in his words. Many of the some of the early opposition in the Social Democratic Party derived from the sense that this was Kohl's baby, Kohl's design, and they wanted nothing to do with something, that came in under Kohl's watch. This is why Naumann, in a way, wanted to put the Social Democrats' imprint on it, make it something other than what Kohl, had kind of left behind. But in the end, they felt, as I did, that the argument itself had become so unseemly, and in fact, it opened up a breach, out of which all kinds of things were now coming. The two most egregious, I guess, examples of the of debate coming out of the breach would be Martin Walser's acceptance speech of the Heine Award, in which he suggested that the Holocaust was being used as a cudgel, against Germans. That it was time, just to it was being over-remembered. And then another even worse essay by Augstein, the editor of Der Spiegel, in which he suggested, in fact, that wasn't this memorial mostly being designed and kind of foisted on us by a cadre of New York architects and Haifa lawyers. I mean, just these funny code words for Jews. And some of basically this is the Jews forcing us to do it. And these remarks now were getting so ugly in a way that the Bundestag did want to close the breach back up, get on with a vote, and in effect, in some ways put the Holocaust behind them. It's true. Does that end memory? And now it's quite clear that people will now choose either to go or not to go. In other words, it doesn't finish the debate. The debate around this can continue around the site itself. Will it be adequate? Will it be open in 10 years? Will it be closed in 10 years or 20 years? How will people deface it? Surely, there'll be desecrations. How will the Germans clean it up? So all those issues, will continue, in play. And there is still opposition. I'd say that it's about 50-50. I think in the public at large, polls suggest that depending on who describes it, about 55% are for, 45 against the memorial to this day. But politically, it was becoming, in a way, more expedient to get it done than to allow it to continue to roil all the waters in Parliament. Yeah, the architect and artist in this case wanted to leave the pillars, in their words, underdetermined. They didn't want to suggest, by describing anything on them, they would actually resonate fairly explicitly as tombstones in some way. And they would also be suggesting a narrative. They wanted to leave this open, a completely open field, so that, in other words, you wouldn't go from this one to this one to this one deliberately, that you would have to find your own way through. They also realized that by really putting information on the stones, they would invite people to spray over and to cover it. Eisenman has now built into the stone. This is going to be poured concrete, but in a very fine sandstone, almost like a sidewalk texture, into which he will impregnate a solution which will repel graffiti, a little bit like the New York City subway cars, so that it'll be easy to clean them off. So there'll be something in them that will make them easier to clean, and they won't take kind of permanent defacing. But they will, as blank slates, they will invite people. People will actually begin writing on them. I'm sure. I'm positive that they will. And this will be an issue actually that they'll probably have to address practically at some point. Okay. It's gravel. Yeah, it will be gravel. Again, Weinmiller's design and Libeskind's design and Eisenman Serra's design all use gravel, which again we like. The small stones leaving traces of the visitors' footsteps, if you will, creating the sound for the visitors to recognize their own visits. And so it creates a kind of a tactile experience. There won't be echoes. It slows down running, practically speaking. It keeps the surface clean. There'll be no weeds growing in it. And people clearly pick the stones and put them on top of these, a Jewish tradition, in effect, but this site will invite an extension of this tradition, in effect. Well, thank you very much.